Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 90, Disaster at Thermopylae. Last time, we left off as Antiochus was getting news that both Eumenes II of Pergamon and the Roman Republic had sent forces to the important city of Chalcis. Let's pick back up again this week and see how he responds to this news. Antiochus III resolved to get to the city first and fight the two forces when they showed up. Accordingly, he sent a man called Menippus with 3,000 men, while Admiral Polixenides would head up to the city with the fleet. Antiochus himself would follow with a force of about 6,000 Seleucid soldiers and whatever Aetolian allies he could cobble together at such short notice. Menippus arrived after the force of Eumenes and the Achaeans had already arrived, but managed to set up camp near the city of Salgoneus when the Roman army arrived. Menippus's forces effectively blocked the way forward and the Romans had to change direction. This is because the Seleucids held the crossing between the Greek region of Boeotia and the island of Euboea. As it stood, the Romans decided to try an alternative route via Delium, which was a temple complex dedicated to Apollo. While the Romans were relaxing in Delium, Menippus fell upon them, killing many and capturing others. This attack dealt a severe blow to the Romans, but further gave the Romans reason not to exactly like the King of Kings. In the meantime, Antiochus III had travelled to Aulis. This is a city about 3 miles or 4.8 kilometres from Chalcis. He sent envoys to the city and tried to appeal to them again, admittedly with an increased threat of force this time around compared to last time. Despite attempts by pro-Roman negotiators to intervene, the gates of the city were opened and Chalcis yielded to the king. Menippus now attacked the Pergamon-held city of Salgoneus, while Antiochus III attacked a fort the Romans were building on the Euripus River. Eumenes II eventually negotiated a withdrawal from the region, and although the Romans were made of sterner stuff according to Livy, the fort eventually fell. Antiochus III now controlled Chalcis, which was the chief city of the island of Euboea. The mainland Greek cities also recognised his dominance. So, from that perspective, he was not in a bad position at all. That said, we now move from 192 to 191 BCE. The Romans appointed a new consul, Marcus Acilius Glabro, to Greece to replace Lucius Quinctius, who'd been commanding there before. Acilius was also allowed to raise up 5,000 non-Roman auxiliary forces. The Romans also bought corn from Africa and Carthage to be sent to Greece for the war effort. Acilius commanded his army to muster at Brundisium on the 15th of May 191 BCE. There would be a formal declaration of war between the Romans and the Seleucids, but the Senate back in Rome didn't really care whether it went to Antiochus himself or just to his garrisons. In their eyes, he'd already done enough with his aggression. At the same time, we also get delegations from Philip V and Ptolemy V arriving in Rome, offering to help in the war against Antiochus. However, this was not accepted in the case of Egypt, while Philip V of Macedon was to act as a second-in-command to Acilius. Now, let's talk for a minute about this offer of help from Ptolemy V. Given that this came from a Roman historian, I was initially skeptical, I have to admit. After all, Ptolemy V is, at this time, the son-in-law of Antiochus III. So, let's look at some other sources. Wikipedia does corroborate this, but just cites Livy rather than a modern-day source, so we're back to square one, effectively. That said, although he also cites Livy, Edwin Bevan also mentions this, meaning it must have been accepted by more recent scholars. It just seemed surprising to me at first glance, but hey, I guess dynastic politics and father-in-law-son-in-law bonds only mean so much compared to giving a rival dynasty a bloody nose. On the subject of help for the Romans, Carthage also offered grain, while the king of Numidia offered military aid. Notably, if we swing over to the other side of the conflict, Antiochus III had no offers of help outside of Greece and Asia, whereas the Romans were able to get the rest of the Mediterranean in line. In Edwin Bevan's mind, not a good omen. That said, Antiochus III had no intention of spending the winter of 192 into 191 twiddling his thumbs in Chalcis. He spent his time getting pledges of support from various parts of Greece. An agreement was also made with Epirus, wherein Antiochus would protect the kingdom and Epirus would make their cities and ports accessible to him. That said, if he couldn't protect them, Epirus would be fine to let the Romans through. Basically, they were trying to avoid working their way into Rome's bad books. They were under no illusion that Antiochus's priority was Epirus. Antiochus hand-waved all of the technical problems away by saying he would send a delegation to discuss. Not the most unambiguous answer ever if you're an Epirot diplomat. I'm sure the Epirots were delighted. Moving on, Antiochus then headed off into Boeotia, which was already resentful of the Romans due to prior history. He got their support before going back to Chalcis. There was considerable debate as to whether they should spend the winter helping the region of Thessaly or just waiting it out in Chalcis. There was a general discussion in which Hannibal, yes he's back, offered the opinion that getting Philip V on side was more important than anything, including the fate of Thessaly. As soon as Philip could be gotten to declare for the Seleucids, there would be no going back for him, and he would be forced to stay on side. Hannibal also took the opportunity to chastise Antiochus for not listening to his strategic advice sooner. If the king had done so, there would now be reports of bits of Italy being burnt to the ground under Hannibal, rather than news of some fort in Greece being the order of the day. In the end, Hannibal was ignored on all counts, except that reinforcements would be obtained from Asia. Antiochus sent a delegation to Thessaly to court their support, and the army was set to muster at Pherae. An attempt was also made to sweet-talk Philip V by burying the Macedonian dead from a previous battle, so I guess to some extent Hannibal was listened to on this front. However, given that we just talked about him offering to help Rome, you can see that did not have the desired effect. Antiochus then tried to capture Pherae, but they were staunchly pro-Roman and held out. Antiochus knew that the result of this siege would determine whether Thessaly in general bowed to him or not, and so he clung on. The city ultimately surrendered after the defenders were forced off the outer wall and into the inner wall. Antiochus spent a merry while capturing cities after this. All the while, a Roman commander called Baebius, or possibly Baebius, Baebius, thoughts on a postcard, was meeting with Philip V. He was also sending subordinates out to defend cities, delaying Antiochus by making him think the armies he could see in the field were far larger than they were and making him hesitate. As we've seen before, hesitation is not exactly unusual for our king Antiochus. We then get an odd little sidebar where Antiochus marries a Chalcis woman as if there was no war on at all. Note that Laodike III is definitely still alive at this juncture, although Wikipedia suggests she may have fallen from favour around this time. Bevan is silent on the issue. Either way, let's now add the Romans into this picture as we move forward. Baebius and Acilius swept through Thessaly and Seleucid governance in the region evaporated. The cities which Antiochus III had convinced over to his side melted away, and the forces garrisoning them readily swapped sides to Philip V and the Romans. The Romans now headed towards the Othrys Mountains, which separate Greece in two like the Apennines divide Italy. Owing to the lack of troops in place in the mountains because of bad military administration, the Romans swept through easily. In the meantime, Antiochus was holed up in Chalcis, now realising that the only thing Greece had given him so far was a dodgy marriage and a nice winter home in the city. Incidentally, he'd fled too here from Demetrias once the Romans arrived in Thessaly, abandoning the region to its fate. You might be surprised by this behaviour. However, Antiochus's Asian reinforcements had not showed up. The picture we are getting overall is definitely one of poor planning coming back to bite the king. Antiochus's hopes now lay in stopping the Romans at the next natural barrier. This was Mount Oeta, which lies at the eastern section of the Othrys. Oeta contains the pass at Thermopylae. If this sounds familiar, yes, it is the pass where the 300 Spartans held off the armies of Xerxes I centuries earlier. Antiochus set up camp and asked the Aetolians to hold the mountains surrounding the camp so as to avoid the Romans being guided through the passes the same way the Persians had been in days of old. This order was obeyed. However, only 2,000 of the 4,000 soldiers actually took the 3 relevant mountains, while the rest just didn't follow. Again, not a great omen. Acilius deployed his men against these 3 high points to try and take them. He gave a rousing speech to his soldiers in which he accused Antiochus III of cowardice in not being brave enough to make a camp in the open, but instead hiding amongst the mountains. At dawn the next day, the Romans arrayed themselves for battle, and Antiochus set his men up too. In terms of the Seleucid battle plan, the weaker men were placed in front of his defensive constructions, with his stronger forces acting as the main force behind the ramparts. Javelins, slings, and archers were placed on the left flank, while the elephants and cavalry were put on the Seleucid right where the walls met a swamp. This setup worked, and the Romans were unable to make a lot of progress as the battle began. However, at this juncture, Roman forethought paid off. A force under Marcus Porcius Cato had managed to take Mount Calidromum while the defenders were asleep the night before. These men now showed up on the mountaintop as the battle raged, and attacked the Seleucids from behind. The other 2 commanders sent to take the other 2 heights had not been successful, but they didn't need to be. The narrow valley and the fortifications of the Seleucids, which had previously been so useful to them, now acted as an obstacle. The army was routed, and the Romans had a merry time of it chasing them off the field, killing and taking men and horses, and killing those elephants they could not take with them. Antiochus himself fled the field. The Romans would have kept their chase up for longer, had they not come across the Seleucid camp and started looting it. Accordingly, there was some relief during the night for the bedraggled Seleucid soldiers who survived the melee in the pass. However, it did not last long. Before daybreak the following day, Acilius sent riders out to hunt down the stragglers. Antiochus was not captured, as he ran as fast as his legs, or more likely his horse, could carry him, up to the city of Elatea. He and a force of 500 men then made it back to Chalcis. For context, he supposedly had an army of 10,000 men with him when he started out the Battle of Thermopylae. Livy notes that another ancient source records 40,000 dead and 5,000 captured out of an army of 60,000. Truly a disaster of biblical proportions. Bevan reflects that Antiochus's Greek adventure would have sunk even without Cato taking Calidromum, seeing how bad the communication was between Europe and Asia. Granted, he also takes this time to wax eloquent about Oriental courts not being able to communicate well within their empire. To my mind, the mere existence of the Persian royal road would contradict this. Admittedly, Bevan then contradicts himself by saying the Romans captured a transporter fleet roughly as Thermopylae was happening, with the corn they brought with them being doled out in Athens. So you can see, despite what Bevan says about Oriental courts, there were some reinforcements on the way. However, I think the point we can see is that this campaign is not exactly being run in the most efficient way possible, even if we take Bevan's 19th century perspective into account. Antiochus fled back to Ephesus, putting the Aegean Sea between himself and the Romans. His new queen Euboea, who was apparently named this by Antiochus so it might have been strategic, went with him. In their wake, Acilius strolled into Chalcis. Not that this retreat and the destruction of his European army meant the end of Antiochus's chances. The Aetolians were still with him, and he poured money over them. Moreover, there were still some Seleucid forces garrisoning cities such as Elis and Demetrias. However, it would have been useless to try and hold the line while Antiochus assembled a new army to fight in Greece. formerly pro-Seleucid regions tripped over themselves to make up with the Romans. These Seleucid forces were allowed to march to Lysimakia under supervision from Macedonian soldiers, while the ships anchored in Demetrias were also allowed to leave. Without Antiochus present, the Aetolians quickly signed an armistice with Rome, as the combined weight of Rome and Philip V bore down on them. Antiochus's attempt to take what his ancestor Seleucus I had conquered in Europe was over. Bevan reflects that Antiochus III was simply born at the wrong time. Just as Seleucus I had done, as we've seen, he systematically knit the pieces of his empire back together. However, the world Seleucus I lived in was not that of Antiochus III. As Bevan tells us, there was now a relentless new player in the Mediterranean, and that player had dealt a hammer blow to Antiochus' designs in Europe. The war would now accordingly shift theatre from Europe towards Asia. The Seleucid world had just gotten a bit smaller. That brings us to the end of today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.